But I think what people are really craving, right, in this kind of sea of connections that we're all drowning in is real relationships, right? Real people that we can actually count on, people that are going to pick up the phone when we call, right? People that are going to respond to our messages, people that are going to happily introduce us to people that can help us. What we call really not just a network, but a tribe, right, of supporters.
Hi, this is Jeff Durso, Inc. 500 serial founder and startup fanatic, and this is Founder Breakthroughs. We've all seen products over the years that fizzle out or go sideways, and other products in the same category that achieve explosive growth and quickly scale to millions. Likewise, we've seen companies enter red oceans with tons of competitors, only to quickly go viral there and dominate. Google did this in the crowded search space of 1998. Facebook did this to MySpace. But how do they pull this off? I'm so excited to bring you today's guest, Vince McPhillip. A trained social scientist and entrepreneur, he spent his career thinking about how to design for massive virality. And he's already done it once, launching the Pi Network to over 3 million users during his tenure and over 45 million users at its peak. Now he's at it again with Nomad, tackling one of humanity's longest-standing challenges, trust. LinkedIn provided a huge breakthrough to the space back in 2003, but has been about as innovative as a snail since then, and may have set itself up for its own MySpace moment. Vince and I had a fascinating discussion about what goes into the DNA of products to make them go viral, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did as you hear his plans for launching Nomad. Without further ado, Vince McPhillip. Hey Vince, how's it going?
Oh, great, Jeff. How's it going? It's a lovely day here in Boston.
Awesome. Hey, fantastic. And thanks for joining us. So the first question I like to ask pretty much of all my guests is, what is it that brought you into the world of startups? And you go back as far as you want.
You know, it's a good question. It's actually a nice question for me to think about. So I was born in Trinidad and Tobago originally, and I actually give credit to my uncle, who was an entrepreneur. He built Trinidad's first cable company, and I have to say that it was actually just watching him as an entrepreneur that really gave me just a ton of inspiration. You know, him being able to build something completely new, and you know, obviously being able to kind of grow a company, you know, from 0 to 1, and then, you know, well beyond that, was just a total inspiration for me.
Very cool. And then in terms of your own, now your background is what, in psychology, or how would you describe your background?
I'm a social scientist by training. I technically majored in political science, but I've also done a ton of business over time.
Yep. And so how does that color the way that you look at the world, right? Because a lot of a startup starts from the lens of how you see the world. I imagine the social science has plays a big role in that.
Oh, absolutely. And I will say sometimes it can be so lonely, you know, as a social scientist in the world of startups, is there's not a ton of us doing this work. I mean, I'm a big believer that, you know, we are the composition of the people that we're around, and that a lot of the thing, you know, the individual, in a sense, kind of being an individual person is often kind of a mirage. And so I think that a lot of the work that I've done is reflective of a deep belief that, you know, we're fundamentally connected to each other, that we're part of something that's bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's a challenge that a lot of founders have, right? Especially if you're sitting in a garage or sitting in a room by yourself, is when you lose that social dynamic, and that it's not even just the feedback loop, although that's important too, but just the energetic flow of people collaborating and ideas kind of getting bigger, you know, as you talk to other people.
Absolutely. And I would say that, you know, that's probably one casualty of the pandemic and of the kind of remote work movement, right? Is that suddenly, you know, a lot more folks are trying to come up with these great businesses, you know, on their own. And as you know, as we can see even here, it's like the amount of information you can get across, you know, through a two-dimensional screen is just limited. And I worry that is actually, you know, impairing the value of the businesses that people are building these days.
Yeah, no, it definitely has limits, right? And then a lot of, you know, what has limits too, and I know we've talked about this, is kind of everything's asynchronous. So there's a lot of asynchronous, and when it's in synchronous, it's in video. versus when you're in a room with other people, there's a lot more energy bouncing off that room.
Totally. And, one thing way I think about it, maybe this is also my social science hat, is that, product market fit and, building companies that touch people in their lives, it's a multi-dimensional problem, right? And so it's very hard to solve these, multi-dimensional extra personal problems in the context of like one person's head. And I know that that's something I've like really struggled with myself over the course of the last couple of years. And, it's kind of, a big part of what I'm doing with my business now.
Yeah. And let's talk about, one of the biggest challenges that startups have is getting any traction at all. And I think one of the most painful things for any startup founder is, they kind of go off and they come up with an idea and they put it out into the world, and it's either crickets or it's like grinding to get 1 user or 2 users or 3 users. And the reason I bring this up is because you have an experience with, and we'll go back to one of your previous ventures, Pi. And it sounded like Pi actually struck a nerve. So I'd love to dive into that story. If you could tell us a little bit about it, and then we could talk about the growth trajectory that it took.
Oh, absolutely. And, one thing I'll say is that, prior to actually conceiving the concept of Pi itself, we actually had a couple of those misses as well. And have had several of them over the course of my career. But yeah, I think one of the things that I always, like to tell folks that are, going into starting their own business is like a process, developing a process that essentially systematically takes you towards product market fit. And I really give us credit, at Pi for following a vigorous process of testing and experimentation and market validation that ultimately led us to something that grew to millions of people around the world. It's not, lightning in a bottle. It's not by chance. It's really the outcome of a systematic process that we were disciplined in following.
So, okay, a lot of questions to deep dive on that. So first off, when you said a systematic process, because I know PMF has been a very interesting process that's evolved in the past few years. Did you have a starting point that you got from somewhere else? Like I remember Superhuman talked about it, and there's a few others. Did you start from, or Sean Ellis, did you start from somewhere else, or did you start with your own framework and then talk about that process?
Yeah. So, listen, I went to business school at Stanford, and, I give a lot of credit to a class at Stanford called Startup Garage. So both me and I believe my co-founder had done Startup Garage prior to when I did it. And Startup Garage is basically a class that's offered at the business school at Stanford that takes the best of design thinking, lean methodology, and some other philosophies to design really a scientific process for validating a concept and bringing it to market. And so thankfully, I was not starting from scratch. I had done that class before, albeit with a different idea, and was really leaning heavily on that work in order to get Pi off the ground.
And what does it feel like? Because if we're being honest about PMF, right, you can have a left brain process to it, but at some point there's a feeling that happens, and you know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh,
there's
yes.
There's before PMF, and then there's you know it when you see it PMF. Can you talk about what was it a bunch of tests that got you to that moment? Like, how did you know that you were starting to get closer to that versus just grinding away?
Well, there's a couple different phases of that, right? And you're right. I mean, as much as we want to kind of boil it down to a science, it is as much of an art as it is a science. And so when I look back at that journey, I think that there are a few kind of key milestones. One was kind of, coming up after the experimentation and testing was, kind of coming up with the kind of initial concept itself. And there's just a certain amount of like a gut check, right? In terms of like, is this something that people would actually use, right? And then, obviously you want to kind of go out there and you want to actually more actively validate that with real people out in the world. So there's that kind of first moment of like, hey, like, it's kind of like the tagline or the solution statement, it kind of leaps off a page and you're like, okay, like this feels like something different. In the case of Pi, it was kind of, mining for the people, cryptocurrency for and by the people. The next phase then was actually kind of, we were doing kind of small experimentation. And I remember the first kind of leap was actually, we had onboarded a few like high school students actually onto the app around this time, when we were first launching back in, I think, 2018. And there was one blip in our kind of, Google Analytics graph in January where it just essentially went viral in a single school. And so that was the kind of initial, kind of indication that there was something there. And then, yeah, so that was one kind of, real kind of on the ground validation. And then once we had that, we felt confident in kind of really putting our, chips on the table and putting the full resources behind it and, launched it. And, the rest is history.
I think that's awesome. Right. And so a lot of times in the podcast, I've talked about luck, right? And a lot of it, so luck is a process, right? And it's a matter of creating this luck surface area.
Yeah.
And how do we kind of place bets? And then more importantly, keep tabs when one of those bets, to your point, spikes. So when you saw this, one of your bets basically paid off better than you may have expected.
Yeah.
Right. Or outsized compared to the others. And then it's a matter of when that happens, you've then got to look at it and step back and say, okay, what happened? How do we replicate this? How do we learn from it?
Yeah, and that's why, by the way, when it comes to replicating, that's why it's so important to, again, be really rigorous about your process, because, it can be very easy to lose track of why you succeed. And that can be even harder in a sense than getting something off the ground, because then if you don't know why something is working, it can just be very, very difficult to replicate. So again, that's another reason for me. It's like having that solid process in place that you can rely on as you're going through it is one of the most important things you can do when it comes to finding product market fit.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough to separate the discipline of the process from the luck itself, because you don't get to decide when the luck happens. That's outside of your control. You just decide on the process. So like this reminds me, like with destinationweddings.com, when we were doing split testing, right? We ran 8 split tests in a row that ended in a dead heat.
Right.
I mean, so clearly we were testing things that were completely irrelevant to our audience, right?
Right.
And then split test number 9 had a 43% statistically significant uptick in conversion.
Wow.
On the variant versus a control. And that one, those were the words stress-free.
Now, oh my God. I was actually going to ask you, Jeff. I was like, so what was it actually?
No, of course. And, being a guy running a wedding company, any woman would look at that and say, duh, stress-free. That's the big thing. But for us, that was like, my wife had that idea. She said, have you thought of the stress angle? Because you're doing a lot of these like convenience and these other angles. Have you done anything around stress? And then we just added the words, literally 2 words, stress-free, to a headline. And not only was it a 43%, and this goes back to what you observed with Pi, 43% immediate spike in conversion on that test. But when we took that and bubbled it out in all directions, so we bubbled it up to our Google ads and like redid all of our Google ads around stress, and then redid all of our pretty much everything around this stress-free concept. Over the course of, months, we probably 10x'd the business off of that. I mean, that's probably, those 2 words are probably what got us to the Inc. 500.
Wow. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. And, by the way, I haven't, mentioned this yet, but I did do one destination wedding myself, with a cousin of mine. And one of the most important kind of elements of it was that it was just the most stress-free way for me to like kind of gather my family. So it's funny again, how you were able to kind of scientifically validate that through a process.
Yeah, there was exactly. So all I could do is execute the discipline of the process until we found that gem, and then got lucky from the gem, and then figured out how to replicate it. And that's what pushed us over the PMF line, right? So, and that's the difference between, you're talking about what Pi, would you say, what 40 million plus users ultimately?
Yeah, around the world. Absolutely.
Right. And with a little more sand in the gears, that could have easily been 0 users, 10 users, 20 users, right?
Easily. And again, we had tested a bunch of different concepts before that were 0 users. So,
so this is tough for founders, right? Because sometimes you have to go through these. You have to be able to differentiate between, am I getting the 0 user outcome because it's a bad idea, or because things aren't quite dialed in yet?
Totally. And I think that's where, like, process on the one hand, but also, experience, right? Having a sense of, this is where also, like, one of the things that's actually kind of the important kind of context for a lot of this is also, right, like, what we ourselves are passionate about, right? And what we ourselves are being called to, and where we're being drawn. And so sometimes I think that can actually go a long way in terms of having conviction, right? With an idea, and being able to, determine whether or not, again, that zero outcome is as a result of, just the idea not being good at all, or if it's just something that you need to kind of tweak. But at the end of the day, it just takes a lot of hard work, and having folks around you that are willing to kind of put up with you in the process.
Okay, so now let's talk about the next iteration. So you've got Pi, and you've kind of got that experience, and you've gotten to see Pi pre-PMF and post-PMF. And so there's something wired now in the pattern matching circuits of your brain that's going to look for that again. Now let's fast forward to Nomad. Where did you get the idea for Nomad? And if you could tell us a little bit about what it is, what problem it's trying to solve, and what your strategy is for solving that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Nomad, again, is like very much kind of birthed out of my own life, and the challenges that I've faced in my own life. And as an immigrant, from Trinidad and Tobago to the U.S. at a very young age, and trying to find kind of where I fit in, right? Trying to find that calling, right, where I can kind of put my unique gifts to the best use. And I always like to think of like the genesis of Nomad in my mind is like when I had a full-time offer from Morgan Stanley when I graduated from Yale to go work there as an investment banker, and I turned that down and instead went to Brazil to work essentially like in the countryside. That's like a whole other story we can delve into another time. But going off that beaten path in today's world is just hard, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're not going down that traditional 9 to 5 kind of corporate path, there are no guardrails, and there is no it's very hard to find the support that you need. And so I think it's really out of my own desire to be independent, to kind of do my own thing, and recognizing that that is just it's a brutal journey today, barbaric, as one of my friends describes it. And you have more and more people that are now kind of waking up to that desire to follow their own kind of calling, and realize their own unique gifts, and we want to be there for them.
I think that's fascinating. Like, one interesting point. So I believe Bill Gates and Steve Jobs might have been born the exact same year. It might be 1955. And someone had pointed out once that the reason that they both succeeded the way they did is because they were at the right place at the right time. Yeah. So they weren't too young to get into it, but they weren't too far into a career to leave that career, because especially investment banking and careers like that, the opportunity cost for starting your own thing gets higher and higher as you go. So there's that sort of interesting thing. But I think what's interesting is what you're kind of saying is, a lot of infrastructure that people take for granted if they're in a stable job, how do you replicate that for the independent or the startup guy, is basically what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. We don't have the comfy corporate office, right? We don't have, Nancy that's around the corner in HR. We don't have the water cooler. We don't have the cafeteria where you can sit down and you can vent with your colleagues about all the tough things that you've gone through in that day. And we're doing work that's arguably, it's harder in a lot of ways. There's a lot more uncertainty. There's a lot more risk. And so the combination of like the increased difficulty of kind of navigating the maze of like finding product market fit, but then the lack of support that you have in that process, I think is, it's not a tenable situation. And so, we're really passionate about trying to help people find those supporters and that tribe that they need while they're breaking out their own.
And where is Nomad on its growth path in terms of like when did you have the idea? What have you done so far, and kind of what's the next big the next big milestone?
Yeah, Nomad, it's been an interesting journey. So what I'll say is that the actual origin story of Nomad itself, and even the name KNOMAD, that was actually my 30th birthday gift to myself. That was back in 2018, I believe, when I was graduating, and I actually took a detour and went and worked on Pi because it just seemed like such an amazing opportunity. We're really seeing these cryptocurrencies were really kind of coming onto the scene, and alternative economies was always something I was interested in. And so I took a detour to do that, and then eventually made my way. And I would say for the last, let's say, like 2 years, have been again going through a very rigorous process of testing, and validating that there's a real customer, a real need, that we can deliver a solution that people will eventually pay for to use. And so right now, I think that we've gotten to, I think where we are now, I was saying earlier about the kind of the phases. I think what we have now in what we're describing as the world's first professional trust network is that thing that kind of jumps off a page and can hook people and that we're getting great responses to. So I feel like we almost have that kind of conceptual product market fit. And now where we are, we have a kind of basic MVP that's developed, and now it's our job to basically translate that concept into a real living, breathing product that we'll be launching in a beta in the upcoming year.
Which is very fascinating, right? And you and I have talked about the when Minsky told me, I think this was 25 years ago, I didn't realize how big of a deal he was when I was in this room with him.
That's funny, by the way, that you were in a class with him. Like,
it was like a freshman seminar that like the concept of the freshman seminar at MIT is you're in a room with people you're not going to be in a room with. So enjoy it now.
Right.
But like Marvin Minsky throwing wisdom at us, said that like, if you can just create something that's 20% better, right? And then he paused. He's like, then you're totally screwed.
Yeah.
He's like, you're going to get, because we were like, yeah, just 20%. He's like, yeah, if you do 20% better, the inertia is going to grind you down and you're going to go nowhere. This is like the Dvorak keyboard versus QWERTY. Like you can't, it just doesn't work. Whereas when you create something that's an order of magnitude better, nothing can stop it. And so if I take that framing, and this is where you and I had an interesting discussion, right? So if we look at like LinkedIn or networks like that are sort of the status quo, they haven't really changed in 20 years, which is kind of fascinating when everything moves so quickly in technology. But if you look at LinkedIn when it came out in 2003, you wouldn't see something very different if you looked at it today.
No.
So what do you believe are the kind of differentiators in a new age, like a trusted network that people aren't getting with the existing incumbents like a LinkedIn? Where's that breakthrough going to come from?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I'll say is that like, we are drowning in connections these days, right? Even for me personally on LinkedIn, I have about, over 3,000 connections, most of whom I have no idea who they are. I actually get requests often for people to, be introduced to my contacts, and I have to kind of, bashfully say that I have no idea who that person is or like where we even would have met each other.
Actually, isn't that the first question now that people ask is, do you even know this guy? Like that, when people ask me, because that's the first test is like, do you know this guy? I'm like, I don't even remember how I'm connected to this person. But
exactly. Right. So, and by the way, I will say that, LinkedIn's function as being kind of this infinite Rolodex, I think is an important function, and that there's a value to that. And I don't think that that's going away. But I think what people are really craving, right, in this kind of sea of connections that we're all drowning in is, real relationships, right? Real people that we can actually count on, people that are going to pick up the phone when we call, right? People that are going to respond to our messages, people that are going to happily introduce us to people that can help us. What we call really, not just a network, but a tribe, right, of supporters. And so I think that is our imperative at Nomad, is to help people build trusted tribes of supporters and people that can fundamentally, have their back. And unfortunately, when it comes to LinkedIn and the degree to which, you could, reach out to a random, member of your LinkedIn network and count on that person for support, getting a 10x or even 100x improvement on that, the bar is actually quite low in today's day and age. And so that's where we see ourselves really delivering is like, we are going to find, that hidden tribe of supporters out there that are rooting for you. They're going to have your back and they're going to help you achieve your dreams.
It's kind of fascinating. It reminds me of, I remember when I took a class at Sloan years ago. And one of the things I talked about was when you look at like an org chart, right?
Yeah.
You kind of see the official lines of authority in an organization, right? But then if you map how does it really work?
Right.
Right. And so there are a bunch of organizational researchers that went in and tried to figure out, it was almost like lines of influence as opposed to, you've got lines of authority that are in the org chart. But when they started mapping lines of influence, they realized that was much more predictive of how things got done in an organization. Right? They figured out who's the person that everyone goes to for certain things, right? And that person may not have authority officially.
Yeah.
But when you kind of mapped these things out, you found that there was a much higher leverage going to that person to get things done. And everybody knew this who worked in the company, like people would figure this stuff out.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's some analog here in terms of what you're working with Nomad, because LinkedIn gives you this kind of org chart mapping, like the infinite network, which is phenomenally valuable.
Absolutely.
It's insanely valuable compared to not having it there.
Yeah.
My first company, a consulting company, we would have killed for LinkedIn. Because now it's like, if I want to get into any company, I can find 5 people to find a way in, and I couldn't do that. But there's something missing, right? And this kind of trust thing, and really mapping that in rich detail. It sounds like that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And, going back to this concept of influence, it took us, I'll say that it took us quite some time to be able to identify, because we, going back to the question, right, of product market fit and experimentation, iteration, there's so many different iterations of this over time. We were always anchored in this idea of the nomad, right? It's this kind of rising independent worker, a new generation of independent worker that was, trying to go their own way and needed support. We tested a bunch of different things. One was kind of a more basic, like reciprocity ring, which was about kind of asks and offers. Another one was kind of more of a contracting platform and helping people find, build Flash teams. We were looking at, helping co-founders finding co-founders and teammates. And it took quite a while for us to identify that real key, secret sauce ingredient, which is the idea of trust. That fundamentally, the kind of the primitive, right, of all of those relationships was the ability to find people that you could trust and rely on. And that, going back to the kind of that, kind of conceptual moment of getting to the world's first professional trust network, was just an incredible, discovery. And I think that if you were to look back at even these kind of lines of influence, I would put my money that like trust is essentially what undergirds that as well, because what gives people influence, right, is and the people that you turn to, the people that you want to go talk to, are ultimately, the people that you trust, right? And so, so it's a really, really kind of special ingredient in today's society, and I think it's something that's like almost like, fish in water or people in the air.
Yeah,
we kind of live and breathe it. It's all around us, but it's kind of still this kind of, hidden entity, and no matter trying to really kind of map it, quantify it, and ultimately build and restore it.
I think that's really cool. It's like there's this complex, nuanced lattice, and you're trying to like spray something on it for it to come to light. Like you're trying to organically uncover it. You're not trying to create it. You're trying to uncover it. But because one of the things you mentioned, I cringed when you said reciprocity network. because like, so that for instance, that's an artificial concept of like I picture like, you picture those people you've met networking, the scorekeepers.
Oh yeah.
Like everything's like, it's exactly 1-to-1 versus like, I take more of a like karmic, make you give a penny, take a penny kind of, right?
Totally.
I'm paying it forward here. I'm getting things over here. And so when you solve this problem the wrong way, it's disastrous, and you can't get that. To get that breakthrough, you've got to discover the real underlying mapping.
That is, thanks so much for saying that, Jeff, because it's something I've been trying to explain to folks as well, which is that, the underlying algorithm that we're developing is called trust vector. And the reason is that there are actually pre-existing vectors that connect us. We are actually all connected. We know this, by the way, from social science dating back to 6 degrees of separation, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, if you prefer, if you prefer that framing. But yeah, I think that the real powerful thing about what we're doing is that it actually, it's a model and a map for an existing reality. It's not something that we're trying to manufacture or, create out of thin air. And so that I think is, really well said.
And it sort of reminds me of my favorite quote. There's a book about the creation of the transistor. I forget who wrote it, but one of the funniest things in there was they were talking, a bunch of the physicists were around a table, and one of them looked over and said, well, yeah, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And everyone kind of laughed,
right?
Because first, everyone, it's always the opposite in real life. But but the reason they laughed is because they had kind of stumbled into something that kind of worked, and they were almost at the transistor. Yeah. But if they didn't have a model for it, it's like blindfolded. You can't turn dials on it.
Totally.
Right. And so another example of this, a friend of mine told me about before they had the models of elliptical orbits of the planets, they literally could plot them because someone, I don't know if it was Kepler, literally every night took notes.
Right. Yes.
And then there's some little equation that eliminates an astonishing amount of work. And so if you could, so part of finding the model is part of what this is about, not just finding the answer, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's funny because I think it's a very apt analogy, right? Because, and I've done a fair amount of this research as part of this exploration as well. I give a lot of credit to Robin Dunbar. He's a sociologist at Oxford and studies primates, actually, so monkeys, and coined Dunbar's number, which kind of.
I was gonna say he's got the number.
Yeah, exactly. So coined Dunbar's number, and a lot of his argument in the kind of research that backs that is that the way in which trust is typically built and maintained in primates actually is through the kind of mental models, right? The observation, right? Okay, that monkey always takes that banana, right? Or they're a really great groomer, and I see that they're always grooming everybody else, right? Like that's literally how we typically build and maintain and study and model trust in our minds, is through that extensive note taking, which worked for millennia, really, right? Because we were limited to the number of people that we would encounter in a lifespan. The problem that we have today is that now we are in touch with and touching, like I said, in LinkedIn, I have 3,000 connections. God knows how many connections I have 15,000 followers on Twitter, right? We now have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that we're connected to. And so I think it's that is the thing that's really shifted over the course of the last, few decades with the digital revolution and the information revolution and, technology, is that now all of a sudden we need models. We actually need a scalable model for trust in a way that, we wouldn't have when we were living in kind of a small, village in whatever, medieval France or wherever it might be.
Yeah, what's kind of fascinating is because you're implying, or say Dunbar is implying, that there's some sort of, it's almost like a compiled base program in our brain that's doing this sort of trust analysis. Like what you said about noticing who you can trust for what. That's not you don't sit there and watch and say, okay, update my thing, and it's got a limit of 150, right?
Right.
There's some advanced circuitry, the same way like our eyes have advanced circuitry in the brain that are doing optical recognition, things like that. And that advanced circuitry is not made for over 150. So the question is, what sort of scaffolding, or it's like a super suit, can you use with technology to give us to approximate that beyond that 150?
Yeah, exactly. I have to say, by the way, I'm really enjoying this because it's actually pushing my thinking live. You know what I mean? Like while we're on this, I'm like, this is very interesting. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And we've uncovered, I think, at Nomad, some of the kind of key, let's say, heuristics, right? And, shortcuts that people use. So like one of the kind of key parts of Nomad is we leverage the power of transitive trust, right? Which is that people take cues on who to trust from the people that they trust. So if, there's a group of people that trust me, and then I trust you, Jeff, as, someone that I've had some great conversations with so far, then there is, in essence, a vector of trust that basically transfers from that person through me to you. And that, I think, rests again on the kind of, it's not a manufactured or invented thing. I think that neatly kind of rests and augments on the existing circuitry that we have, that we're programmed to use.
Yeah, these are like shortcuts, right? So you think about, it's not a perfect analog, but you think about Cialdini's book Influence, right?
Yes.
Where we sort of use these like 7 shortcuts to quickly make decisions in terms of whether we can trust other people. And there's obviously a lot more shortcuts built into us than the ones that he covered, right? This is sort of implying towards that, right? And so the question is, how can you most closely model reality? Because what you're trying to get through is that 10x breakthrough.
Yep.
Right. That's gonna hit PMF, and then it's gonna hit the kind of explosive growth.
Totally. And I think, when I think about even, the types of products, right, that win, right, the types of products that are able to, touch that nerve, as you say, right, it needs to attach, I think, to something that is, fundamental, right, to the way in which we as people operate. It needs to attach to something that we can relate to, that we can understand. And so I think that that's why, like, the best products really are, they sit atop kind of that existing machinery. They don't try to completely create something that's brand new. I think that's just very, very hard to do. And so I think that it's a very interesting thing of, like, it's, by the way, something that, like, subconsciously I've kind of understand that what we've developed at Nomad is actually, like, it's a model for how trust works in society, but it's been really helpful in kind of fleshing that out in this conversation.
So here's what's weird about those things when you get them right? Because this is another thing that we're kind of wired as humans, that we can take as a mental model a really good tool. We could very quickly becomes like a part of our body.
Oh yeah.
Right. So you picture like race car driver. To the race car driver, the car is just an extension. In your brain, it's very natural. Right. And when you have these experiences where it really models the reality, the weird thing about it is it feels obvious to you when you put this thing on, right? It's like putting that Iron Man super suit on. And even though it's brand new, it feels like something that's like, duh, like this was supposed to be here all along. What took you so long?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's taking you so long?
Hey, listen, I'm wondering that myself these days. But isn't it actually kind of funny though, that, like, these things that would be, I mean, I always think about, right, the best companies, right, they seem so obvious in retrospect, right? Like, of course, like, in the case of Google, that you would organize, once the web got built, you would organize the world's information. Of course, that makes sense. But just really interesting how, despite the fact that it is so natural and it can be something that's as natural and as water, right, to a fish, or to, as air is to a person, that there's something still about, like, it's almost like the closer it is to you, the more fundamental it is, the harder it is to actually, kind of wrap your head around and understand it, kind of, get distance from it, and, quantify and measure and scale and all that stuff. So that itself is kind of just like an interesting vein of inquiry, just for, the process of invention, and what the implications of that are.
Well, and also I think there's still some laws of physics that it has to apply or it doesn't work. So if you look at artificial intelligence or generative AI, right? Generally speaking, it's very bizarre, right? I heard a friend call it an artifact, not a technology. It's just this weird thing.
Yep.
But when you then put specific scaffolding on top of it, so my experience with GitHub Copilot, for instance, writing code, is one of these crazy experience, like a supersuit experience, like what we were just talking about, where suddenly it literally felt like I had another person like doing pair programming with them.
Right.
What they described is not just a marketing statement. It's literally what it feels like when you start using it. I can't imagine not using this ever again. Right. If I look at, like, Google versus what was there before it, was this obvious thing. Facebook versus MySpace. And so a lot of times the world gets into this, like, stasis, but the breakthrough is ridiculously different than the stasis, because when Google launched, people were like, what kind of idiot would launch a search engine into this red ocean?
Right.
And boom, the breakthrough was real. And same with Facebook, with MySpace. So it's like, this is where it's an interesting, if you can figure out that model, you have a shot at the 10x. That's what's really interesting to me.
Yeah. And I think, again, I just want to kind of get back to what you were saying about it, which is that it's just interesting to me that, because you typically think of a process of invention as a quote unquote creative process, right? That kind of adds something new to the world. And I think one of the themes that's really standing out of me in this conversation, something I'm going to think more about, is that actually some of the most successful inventions and creations are things that simply better harness the existing kind of energy or configuration or laws of the world as they currently are. You know what I mean? And yeah, that's just an interesting kind of intellectual thread. I think I want to kind of probably, take a note on and then go a little bit deeper on in the future.
No, I think that's a great point, right? And if you look at like a Ford Model T versus like a Lamborghini Aventador, right? And the latter is just an extreme 100-year iteration to perfection of a lot of different aspects of the dynamics, right? Right.
But the quantum leap really happened with, the Model T.
The idea of the car, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it's interesting there. So there are emergent leaps that can happen from the breakthrough of like, hey, we can do a car. Other times, what's interesting to me, this is called the Tim Cook lens on Apple. Because Tim Cook is not Steve Jobs.
No, yeah.
But when you look at the Vision Pro could be like Tim Cook's iPhone moment. I think I heard someone describe it. Because it's sort of when you extreme out all the pieces, suddenly there's a believability that, because the problem with AR is it's not believable when you put it on. It's not, or VR, it's not quite there.
Yeah.
So it's possible that just being extreme kind of optimizing could actually create that breakthrough.
Yeah, very interesting. Two different, and I'd be curious then to kind of like, if you were to kind of go back and look at, kind of successful inventions, right? And kind of creations, it'd be kind of interesting, I think, to look at, of the kind of, most kind of valuable or successful inventions over the course of the last like couple hundred years, how many of those were actual kind of like incremental, kind of optimizations, right? That kind of get you to kind of a step change or some kind of different reality versus something that feels like a little bit more of like a fundamental leap. Are there fundamental leaps? Are we kind of giving ourselves too much credit here? Or is it right? Because arguably, right, like even when I think about, Nomad, like we're iterating on the social network, right? Which is something that, although I will say though, that it does feel like a little bit of a step change in my mind. It's just like a very different model for how those networks work. But I'm sure I'd be curious. It reminds me, there's a guy named Chad Jones at the GSB who studies total factor productivity in economies and the kind of creation of ideas, and actually is studying this kind of question or issue as to whether all the good ideas have been harvested, or what is that kind of pool of ideas? How does it shift or change over time? It's just an interesting field of study.
It's bizarre. And, it's kind of a good place to kind of end towards. It's like, so if you think about the role of the entrepreneur, right? So founders sometimes can just optimize like crazy. So you can optimize, you can find breakthroughs. Sometimes like, if you look at something like with the telephone, apparently there was like someone invented it at the same time, but Graham Bell got to the patent office like a day ahead of him. Like, so sometimes there are things where it's like, you've got a super saturated solution and the first person in, gets a breakthrough. Sometimes like, if you look at like the Tesla or SpaceX, these are things that would have inevitably happened, but Elon kind of forced them much faster. Kind of brought them a lot closer than they would have. Even you could say that about a Steve Jobs or even a Bill Gates, who's not a Steve Jobs, right? Who was more of the optimization. So there's a lot of these different ways that you can bring the future. It's like you're grabbing the future and pulling it towards you.
Yeah, totally. And I would argue probably, right? I'm always a big both and thinker. So I would argue that like, you probably want to have like, ideally you're going to combine both methods, right? You're going to have that kind of, visionary, ability to kind of see into the future and put yourself at the right place at the right time, not too far ahead, right? I've done that before, by the way, where you're a little bit too far ahead of the crowd, get Lance out just far enough ahead, but then also just be brutally efficient about, optimizing and that kind of day-to-day execution. And I think that's probably, if I would guess, if you were to look at the truly, most successful companies, they're probably doing a little bit of both.
And if I can I'll just throw an equation out there. It may or may not stick, but I've been obsessed with this for the past few years. So if you take Ohm's law, right? V equals IR, but you move it to I equals V over R. So I is flow of current, which I just changed to flow.
Yeah.
So flow equals voltage divided by resistance. So when I think about that, and I think about optimization is taking that R and making it as small as possible.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's removing frictions out of the system. And then voltage is special sauce magic. It's like creating something new.
Yeah.
And I kind of think of like optimizing flow as you can either you can make V bigger or R smaller. And to your point, both. It has both. To, ultimately the answer has to be both.
I think so. Wow, that's a really powerful way of thinking of it. It's actually kind of funny, not to go off, but I've been thinking a lot about my own. Oh man, that's actually really profound, because I've actually, funnily enough, and this is not as much to do with the business, but I've been thinking about my own kind of wattage, let's say, over the course of the last. I do a lot of self-optimization stuff, and one of the key things I actually just came up with just over the last couple of months in my kind of life operating system is that in addition to doing things, right, which in this case, kind of new plans and kind of creation, which I think in your equation might be more the voltage, that removing things out of the way. Charlie Munger, who just passed away, has this kind of inversion principle, which is like, don't do stupid stuff. And so I've also now been thinking a lot about what not to do, what to take out of the way in order to let that flow. So I want to go a little bit deeper on that, because I think that actually, again, getting back to, models of reality, I think that's a really powerful model, both for me, I'm seeing kind of at an individual level, and then, in the context of a company as well.
Yeah, I've been kind of obsessed with it for a couple of years, and so part of it too. My partner in Native Brain, when he's sort of he's expert in education and learning, and he said that the key to learning is flow, and we know that flow is a super state that humans can get into. He said if you're in flow, your learning is orders of magnitude higher quality than if you're not. And we kind of said when we built that is that there's two, flow is one of those things where like, we don't know how to put you in it, but we certainly know how to get you out of it.
Right.
And so if we kind of modeled like, what are all the things that children's apps do that kick people out of flow?
Right.
And we just maniacally and obsessively eliminated those. Like, for instance, like most kids' apps, not to go on too far of a tangent, you'd answer a question right, and we'd look at our watch and it'd be like 11 seconds before you have another question, because it's like monkeys dancing and stuff happening, and we're like tick, tick, tick.
Right.
So the extreme of that is we had a wave editor opened up on a 50-inch monitor, taking the tone that it tells you when you're right or wrong, and we were trying to scrunch it as far as we could.
Wow.
So that on native numbers, it's like 0.6 seconds task reset. You answer a question and boom, 0.6 seconds later it comes back. So we kind of removed the speed bumps, and then obviously there's a lot of voltage stuff that's in the adaptive algorithm.
Totally.
So we hit flow a lot with that, and we've had a lot of teachers tell us, like, kids that are normally ADD that can't handle it can hit flow because of it. So I just think it's really as a tool for, especially when you're engineering something that you want to go viral.
Yeah.
You can't obsess too much about flow, I guess, is sort of what
I love also, by the way, like the idea of even, because a lot of my work, by the way, studies kind of, like I said at the beginning of this call, individuals and then kind of collectives, right? And so the idea of, virality as like a collective state of flow, I think is just a really powerful, interesting, concept.
Just think about it as, right, in a nuclear reaction, right? Yeah. The most likely outcome is fizz.
Fizz, exactly.
And the other outcome is, 100 megaton blast.
Chain reaction. Yeah.
And there's a big difference between the outcome of those two, even though it might just be subtle differences in terms of lining things up.
Absolutely.
The inputs. So
very cool.
Cool. So two more questions. So if you could fast forward 5 years from now, where would Nomad be? What's your goal?
So Nomad is actually, believe it or not, it's a trilogy. So there are 3 phases to Nomad. So we're currently launching the first phase of the project. Our mission in this phase is to build trust and show how we're all connected. And our vision is actually a new form of federated intelligence, which you can think of as basically AI that you can trust. Okay, so that's the first phase. So When I think about Nomad in 5 years, I think we have a thriving community of millions of people around the world that trust each other, that are working with each other, that are supporting each other. And we will have released KIN, the Nomad Intelligence Network. That's our federated intelligence. That will essentially be a pool of collective knowledge and wisdom. And that will be phase one. And excited to reveal the next phases as time goes along. But that's what I hope for in 5 years.
Wow, that's insanely exciting. Cool. Okay, and the last question is, where can people learn more about you and Nomad?
So you can go to our website. It's Nomad, KNOMAD.io. And sign up for our waitlist there. We're getting ready to launch a beta in Q1 of the upcoming year. Whether you are an entrepreneur, you're a dreamer, you are a doer or builder, your tribe awaits. So we hope that we'll see you there.
Awesome. Hey, Vince, thanks so much for taking the time. This was hugely insightful, and I'm now itching. I demand that this thing comes sooner. I want to start using it today. So
yeah, and I have to say, Jeff, thank you so much for just the thought-provoking conversation. It leaves me with a lot of just really interesting threads and ideas I wanna go deeply on.
Awesome. Hi, it's Jeff. Thanks again for listening. Innovation is a strange thing, sometimes stalling for long periods of time, then suddenly going through a burst when something new and better comes along. I think you'll agree that Nomad could be that something, and it will be exciting to watch how it disrupts this trust space. Please remember to share this episode and the show to others who you think could benefit, and let me know if there are any burning topics you want me to discuss. Thanks again for listening. See you on the next episode.